Welcome to the sixth and final part of the world's first six-part Bookinar series hosted by Al Admansky. Al's latest book, Impact: 6 Patterns to Spread Your Social Innovation, explores in depth each of the 6 mutually reinforcing patterns which are being used by successful changemakers. Each 1-hour session in this series, Al focuses on one of the 6 patterns identified in his book and interviews the person who revealed the pattern to him, both through their convictions and their work. Today's Bookinar is entitled Who is as Important as How, and Al has invited his special guest, Darcy Riddell, Director of Strategic Learning at the J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, to join him. I will now turn it over to you, Al, to begin this conversation with Darcy about who is as important as how.
Thank you, Christy, and hello, everyone. Welcome to Who is as Important as How. Kind of sounds like Dr. Seuss, doesn't it? I'm very excited to begin my chat with today's guest, Darcy Riddell, who I will introduce to you very shortly. But first, a few words about this pattern. I believe that breath is as important to making the world a better place as a sophisticated strategy or the latest social technology. Social change can be harsh and unyielding. It can breed mistrust, frustration, cynicism. It can cause you to lose faith in people, in yourself. It can infect your emotions, your spirit, your relationships. In my case, I found myself becoming the dragon I had set out to confront. If we are not careful, social change can close our hearts as opposed to opening them. The antidote, in my opinion, to pay attention to what has heart and meaning. Think of a leader you admire and describe them in your mind. Chances are you'll describe qualities of character and conviction. Similarly, the individuals you met in this series and that Vicki and I met during our 2-year exploration of social innovation are impressive collaborators, communicators, conveners, entrepreneurs, and strategists. They know how to get things done. But they are more than talented doers. There is one warm line that unites them. There is a spiritual dimension to their lives. They pay attention to their blind spots or limitations, and they pay attention to what nourishes and replenishes them. No one embodies that more than my guest today, Darcy Riddell. Darcy is a scholar, a mentor, a consultant, an activist. She's been in the trenches, she's been on the front lines, she's a practitioner, she's a cogent theorist, and a confident, thoughtful group facilitator. She can joyously participate in the swirl that is social change, and equally, she can help you, me, us make sense of that experience. Darcy, welcome.
Thank you so much, Al.
Darcy, I want to start by asking you what that theme or title means to you. In other words, what does who is as important as how mean to you?
In some ways, I think it's been the kind of a frame that could capture the last 20 years of my own journey of trying to understand and contribute in some way to making the world a better place. I cut my teeth as a forestry campaigner, first on Vancouver Island, working at multi-sector land use tables and being in very contentious and polarizing situations that also felt extremely hopeless in some ways, because Vancouver Island was one of the hardest hit areas by industrial logging, and seeing how it wasn't working for communities and it wasn't working obviously for the forest itself, and seeing the devastation that was happening. I moved into social change as an environmentalist. But I quickly realized that we were creating a wake of broken relationships, and that the approach that we were taking wasn't going to have the impact that we wanted it to have. Both because of the limited opportunity space where we were working, but also because we needed to learn a lot more and open ourselves to the possibility of what real transformation could be. So I'd say my journey kind of took me from learning what it meant to be a young forestry campaigner in contentious rooms and working with First Nations and logging company representatives and fisheries experts and community leaders and tourist operators, to kind of going on a journey of my own, because I felt like we had the ecological system kind of nailed. We knew what was true and right and good, which provided us with a certain platform for righteousness. And then at the same time, I felt like we lacked maps for how do we actually navigate the values differences here, and what does it actually mean to come together and shift people's thinking in a way that we can actually authentically feel like people's multiple hopes, dreams, and objectives are being met, instead of just entrenching into stuck, separate views of the world. So I've kind of my whole 20 years of work has been chewing at different bits of that delicious question of how do we access our own hearts and wisdom, so that we can create an alternative future, and navigate the values and the cultural aspects of that, as well as the psychological and political aspects.
Well, I'm enjoying your metaphors here. Platforms of righteousness versus or and valleys where our hopes and our dreams and our aspirations live. Can you think about, was there one moment when this realization, this evolution in your thinking or your consciousness caught hold, or was it just sort of a slow and steady? Can you actually bring us back to when the aha happened?
Well, for me, it happened through a transition where I'd been working on Vancouver Island, and then I decided to go on a journey to India for 6 months, because I felt like I needed to explore consciousness in its many forms, and find a vision of healthy humanity that was as grand and vast as what I felt like I had understood from ecological teachings, if you will. So I left what was a dream job for me as a forest campaigner, and went and really decided to explore my own inner landscape, and that had to do with also taking responsibility for my own grief, and learning about myself and being much more aware of my impact on others. And then I traveled in India, and I learned some meditation, and I went to Dharamsala, where I met His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And it's like a very privileged kind of the ability to go and travel and explore like that. But I felt in a really deep way that I couldn't do the work that I needed to do without having some really deep and really vast inner resources. And I guess one of the moments for me that was this turning point was coming home from having been on this journey and getting lured by my friend and colleague Maren Smith back to work on forest campaigns, except we were working now on the Great Bear Rainforest, where there were 100 plus unlogged valleys. It was the largest remaining area of coastal temperate rainforest left in certainly North America and in the world that was unprotected. And so started working there, but really I within a couple of weeks of coming home from India, and I had done my own kind of inner journey, I found myself up at Hollyhock retreat center in the midst of a strategy session where First Nations and environmentalists were we were duking out, deep, difficult questions of colonization and how to protect land but not foreclose economic options for communities that desperately needed opportunity and employment and hope and healthy cultural expressions. And so in this, it felt like I had entered a new world of campaigns where people were actually speaking from a deeper place with one another, where we were really tackling some of the issues that we had to around how to deal with justice and decolonization, along with advancing an environmental vision. And it was like, wow, I went and did this work because I felt like it was necessary, and now the world is kind of mirroring back to me the possibility of something different taking place. So I think at that point, I really recognized that there was this dance between who I was and wanted to become and what was possible out in the world. And so for several years after that, I worked, 6 more years on the Great Bear Rainforest campaign. And I'm a little husky this morning because I was out dancing and talking late last night because it was the final celebration of 19 years of work of people to protect the Great Bear Rainforest. And it was incredible to see all the different people who had been involved over the years in all different sectors coming together. And sometimes it feels like an endless string of announcements, but this really, I think, is the final bookend. So it was a really incredible point at which to reflect about how long change takes, how much it depletes people's resources, but also completely depends on their heart and vision.
So Darcy, I want to pursue some of the insights and wisdom that emerged from the campaigners associated with this marvelous decision that was made, or announcement yesterday, around the Great Bear Rainforest. But before I do that, I want to ask you to just talk a little bit more about grief. When you went to India, you mentioned that there was grief or loss involved, and before we move on, I just wonder if you could express that in more detail, what you mean by that, and is that vital for all of us?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks. I mean, we all have our own stories about what touches us deeply, and where our tenderness lies. And for me, I came to care about the environment because it felt like an expression of what was wrong in my home province of British Columbia with sort of corporate control and these. So I felt very alive to the mission and the call to protect forests, but I also was really aware of the feeling of urgency and despair around conservation issues, because people didn't seem to get it or care 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, those of us who were looking knew that climate change was coming down the pipe. And so for the experience of carrying those kinds of concerns, everyone who's working on a social issue has that experience. But what I started to realize was that the reason that I had an affiliation for this kind of feeling of despair was also because of my own story of loss. So from early childhood, my father was diagnosed with leukemia, and he died when I was 7. And I think that my own journey of grief and healing, and my ability to kind of be honest, feel loss, dig through the layers, the sedimentary layers of my personality, and kind of come to know that vulnerability and space of grief in myself opened me up much better to be able to be with the despair that I and others were feeling about the state of the world. So I really do see the kind of connection between my own personal story, and that's how most leaders that I've seen who are able to compel others to join them and to stick with difficult change making over the long haul is that they understand, they've dug in and found what has heart and meaning for them, but also done some of the healing work so that we're not just reproducing our own egos out into the world. And that's a really important aspect of why I also have been drawn to Buddhist teachings and as a way of continuing to observe and tame my own ego and need to paint the world with the picture in my own image.
Darcy, I thank you for that insight and your personal reflections. I'm noting as well that that our language is shifting, isn't it? Grief, heart, loss, vulnerability, healing, despair, tenderness are part of the lexicon of social change as much, perhaps even more so than attack, fight, war, and all of those metaphors. So I'm appreciating how your language is opening up to describing the experience of wanting to make the world a better place with kind of more versatility and more options than simply those original kind of war metaphors or political metaphors that we tend to use. But Darcy, I want to talk about this. Your perspective began, although it hasn't ended there, because you've roamed into other territory and other territories and other sectors. Many of our listeners will not be campaigners or may not describe themselves as activists, but they are not only change makers, but actually extremely important and critical to the whole process of making the world a better place. And so for those of us who are embedded in the more obvious parts of a system, for example, those who may work inside government or for large nonprofits or corporations. So these are formal structures within our systems. And they likely have to work differently. They probably have to tread water for longer than we have to do. They have to, understand and sense how change happens within a large, formal, perhaps bureaucratic structure, as opposed to the kind of versatility that and flexibility that we may have if we're not working inside. So in that regard, do you have any reflections or thoughts? Because I know your own experience has led you into contact with changemakers of every persuasion. Do you have any advice for those of us who are embedded in the more formal parts of our system to protect our spirits and maintain our humanity?
I do. I have some ill-formed or partially formed thoughts about that, I think. Again, last night being in this celebratory room with people from government and First Nations leaders and environmentalists and community leaders who've been working for 20 years on change from all different sides of the system to implement these Great Bear Rainforest agreements. I was struck by how many people have spent the better part of 20 years of their lives from a time where they may have felt completely constrained by the institutions they were working in to a point now where it's absolutely clear that if they hadn't stuck with it within the institutions they were in, this kind of change could never have been enshrined with the original kind of spirit and intent. So it's interesting. I do feel like, often there's this sort of sexy change maker idea, but really anyone who's been involved over the long haul in something that's actually embedded change knows that, there's so many important roles to play no matter where people are in the system. I mean, I would say more to the point, there are lots of people who are in such institutions and don't even know where to begin or where to get traction. Or it feels like things just reproduce themselves. And so I think there again that there is such a huge value of sourcing from what has heart and meaning, and being creative in seeing what possibilities there are. Even I've noticed my own tendency to kind of edit out possibility and just, especially if I'm stressed out or carrying so many different things, but just the way that we kind of foreclose options before we've actually even entertained them. So I find that, doing some of the work to support our inner lives and contemplation, and really tapping into the values that are central to our work, and a kind of commitment to really see those as primary as opposed to seeing the system we're embedded within or institution as primary, creates opportunities. So, I remember doing my own thought experiment. I was in despair at being stuck in a particular organizational structure, and somebody said, what would it be like if you just acted as if you didn't have those limitations? And of course, I still had many of the limitations, but I realized how many more I had kind of embedded in myself that weren't real. And so I think that can translate into everyday relationship changes. It can translate into being able to speak to core and underlying values in a meeting space where decisions are being made that are important, and can really shift directions and remind people of what's important. And it also has to do with those people who are partly tasked with looking outside of the institution around trends and being responsive to better respond to social and environmental opportunities as they come, because organizations have a way of hunkering down when external threats appear, but those can also be felt to be incredible opportunities that can meet the goals of the organization as well. So I think just it's a lot around people's self-identity and how and who they want to be in their role. That is what really has, I've observed, is what makes, outstanding civil servants or outstanding corporate leaders, is those who are actually willing to follow their own deep beliefs and do what seize opportunities to do what they feel is right.
Thank you, Darcy. I want to bring us back to some of the lessons of the Great Bear Rainforest. As a young campaigner, you witnessed, as you mentioned, conflict-ridden forest policy in an area of British Columbia which the environmentalist decided to call the Great Bear Rainforest, which in itself is a very interesting approach to making change. And the conflict involved, of course, environmentalists, timber and industry representatives, unions, Indigenous people, and yesterday, as you mentioned, which would be February the 1st, if you are listening to this as a podcast, the government of British Columbia announced, in the company of First Nations people and timber industry representatives and environmentalists, a commitment to protect over 80% of the land mass, stretching, I think it's almost 6.5 million hectares of the coast of British Columbia. And there are undoubtedly many pivotal moments that led to that announcement. One must be the story which you've told me, and that many others have mentioned as well, and that I so loved that I put it in my book, which was the story of breath and the note that was slipped to one of your negotiators that had the word breathe on it. Is that simple, but of course that was symbolic of the shift that you've already heralded. But I wonder, could you just briefly tell us that story and and your own conclusions related to that critical event?
Yeah, well, the end of the story, I mean, the end of that little vignette is really that, in environmental organizations successfully, through creating markets pressure on companies, had entered into negotiations directly with the forest companies that were logging on the coast of BC. Without government in the room, it was a kind of a independent set of negotiations to really look at, instead of the small incremental changes that government policy was offering, could there be something that was much more transformative to shift the whole paradigm of logging on the coast. And so these negotiations that were happening, it was a little bit at gunpoint. The forest industry did not want to be there, but they were losing. In some cases, at the end, the threat was of over hundreds of millions of dollars worth of logging contracts were on the chopping block, if you will. And so you can imagine how stressful these negotiations were between the forest industry and the environmentalists. And, often Marin Smith, my colleague, would talk about it was like we would spit bullets at each other and then hide behind our shields while the other side spat bullets back. And things really had to change. And so there's a long arc of capacity building and learning and skillful mediation that happened that led up to different points where final value lists were being negotiated. And but when things got really, really gridlocked at one point, critical point in the negotiations, because of some work that the campaigners had been doing, learning meditation, trying to take the perspective of who is across the room and sustain being able to see them as essentially human and wanting happiness and not wanting to suffer, kind of opening up to that compassionate perspective. So at some very pivotal moment when things were going sideways, one campaigner slipped the other one a note just reminding her to breathe and just find a way to open up to the larger possibility of what was being advanced. And there were many, many moments like that, which were the product of people who were trying to do something different, realizing that they needed some different tools. And part of the tools was that their own identities needed to become more flexible. And so, there are lots of amazing spiritual and psychological tools out there for making one's self more flexible in times of conflict, and shifting the view to see the whole and not just work from one's narrow idea of what's right. And so many moments in that campaign, people were able to set aside these kinds of collapsed or contracted and righteous perspectives to sink into the deeper purpose and find a way to build something that now stands as a global model of conservation, and it's looked at all over the world as a model of ecosystem-based management and economic development for First Nations, and it really is an example of the shift to co-management and enshrining Aboriginal rights and title on the land that had been colonized, and not that the title had never been settled prior. And so these agreements, because of the continuous commitment to both flexibility but a fierce eye on what was possible, and what was just and what was ecologically sustainable, and then tying people's own stories together in a sort of net of collaborative action. This is what was able to be created over the last 19 years. It's been an incredible thing to watch.
That's marvelous. I'm just noting as well, as you're talking, how you shift back and forth with the language from spitting bullets at shields to appreciating the humanity of the other, to weaving a web of stories, etc. I love the expansive language that you're using, Darcy. We have a question from one of our listeners, very much appreciated question, because it brings us to the point of talking about what some people might call personal practices. Our bodies can't exist without oxygen. Our souls need similar nourishment, just as we must protect the air we breathe from contamination, so we must protect the source of our moral oxygen. This phrase is one I borrowed from a Quebec philosopher and a good friend of mine, Jacques Dufresne. He argues that unless we protect the source of our moral oxygen, we are vulnerable to heartache, burnout, addiction, cynicism, and further, he warns that the loss of the soul is painless. And so it's not something that necessarily knocks on your door and reminds you to pay attention to it. And so I want to ask you about personal practices, and I know one of yours is that you are a professional hula hooper. Not only can you hula hoop in daylight, I've seen you do it with a hula hoop set on fire. But I know as well that you have other practices that nourish your soul, or if you will, protect the source of your moral oxygen. And I know you've studied what other people do as well. So I wonder if you could open up this part of the conversation to describing your own personal practices, but also because there are a myriad of ways in which we can, as Rumi says, kneel and kiss the ground. Also, if you could, kind of alert or remind us of other pursuits. So your response to that, Darcy.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. For me, I took to heart this very question, and I was burning out. I burnt out a couple of times in my 20s from activism, and I recognized that I was trying. I mean, the complexity of the kinds of things that we are facing at this time on the planet is obviously, it's huge. And so how do you find your own source of action that feels like it can actually make a difference? And I know that question is one that I've heard so many people express. And yet that kind of, it often feels like we're being pinched between, like, we can see how big the problems are, but we are so small. And I often, I've taken a lot of courage from a quote from Guru Padmasambhava, who is one of the great teachers in the Tibetan tradition, that says, may my view be as vast as the sky, and may my actions be as fine as flower. And you can only do what you can do that's right in front of you, and that's something that I have, that's a kind of a starting point. But to Al's point about the moral oxygen and the breath, I think just simple awareness practice, there's nothing more powerful. If we're trying to be aware of and transform the systems that we're embedded within and part of, we absolutely have to do it with awareness. And that awareness comes moment to moment, and that awareness lives in the breath and it lives in the body. And so, we cannot crack this nut with our intellects. I know because I've tried. I have a PhD in systems change, and it's a fine adjunct to whatever else, but it's absolutely not sufficient to think that we can hold both the terror and the possibility in our minds. And so better, you can, what the breath is really a metaphor for the integration of releasing from the mind into the body. the body can hold a lot more. Our emotional landscape is much broader and more nuanced than we think. And then finally, the realm of spirituality and whatever that means for us, and the train of our own psyche and spirits provides incredible spaciousness to be able to rest in. And so it's there's actually in a moment to moment basis, if one is feeling despair, this is again some of the teachings that I've been given by the Chogyam Trungpa is amazing Tibetan teacher, and he would talk about how being alive and being human is like having an open wound and walking around with an open wound. But that open wound is not something to kind of cover over and cower about. It's our connection to the broader experience of what it means to be alive. And so this idea of like, how do we stay vulnerable and in relation? And so usually it's when we're shutting down and trying to make ourselves protected where we actually cut ourselves off from the sort of vastness that's available. So, I mean, all of the contemplative practices and spiritual practices that I know of are essentially getting at that, which is when you actually just sit in the stillness of your own awareness, you realize that there's infinite love, there's infinite space, there's infinite possibility, and that can inform the next small action. So, I've done different, and we worked on different meditation practices in the midst of action. One of them that I felt was really powerful is called Tonglen, which means taking and sending. In Tibetan, and it's really you breathe in, so getting out of your own suffering, and if you're often we're projecting it outward, so there's I'm so upset about or so moved by the seeing the plight of Syrian refugees and these children, and and instead of feeling despair, it's like that despair is a thread of humanity that connects us. And so breathing into that space, and what taking and sending meditation does is that you breathe in all of the perception of suffering in the world outside, and you breathe it into yourself, and then you send back love, and your body becomes this kind of space where the despair comes in and it's transformed back into love and connection, and that kind of exchanging of oneself with the other is, there are practices across all spiritual traditions that do that, loving your brother as yourself. You can find it in every religious tradition, is how to lessen the grip of our own sense of self. And so in fact, it's when we feel the most despairing is when our self is the most contracted, and that the antidote or the solution to that is really expanding the self. And for some people it's dance or bike riding or gardening or just connecting to that which is greater than us. I see it in the eyes of my children every day, like this sort of beauty that pulls me out of my narrow perspective. So yeah, there are lots and lots of ways, different tools and practices that can support, and everyone has a different path to take on that. But just one more point is that we also live in this, I come from a kind of the Western white lineage of the sort of broken stories and forgotten history. I didn't have a spiritual tradition or real community traditions as a child, and so I've gone and searched them out. Others have remnants of meaningful ritual and or religious frame in their own lives, or still more have rejected that because they feel like religion has been an engine of hatred as much as awakening. And so at this time we all have to figure out how we sit with spirituality, how we want to enter into our own inner lives, and so for many it's through psychology and not spirituality, but something that takes us into the inner terrain and helps us work, be as diligent there as in the outer world is an absolutely necessary accompaniment to change making.
Thanks, Darcy. And I want to thank Carolyn Cook for framing the question and moving us into that area. And for our listeners, please don't hesitate to throw a question or two in your in the panel that you have available if you're listening online. Darcy, I wanted to just observe that your point about that we can't crack these challenges as social change makers with the intellect alone. It reminds me of the quote from the great French existentialist philosopher Simone Weil, who said, "Intelligence is enlightened by love." And it strikes me fundamentally that the answer to this question about dealing with our anger, our frustration, our despair, our grief is not resolved magically, but I think in many ways you're saying it's resolved with discipline. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and because I think for some people that can end up being something else to beat themselves with and feel, less than because they don't have enough discipline or so. So I think it's more about making a commitment that the inner life is part of the journey to change making, and sort of and tending to that. So there is a discipline there, and certainly there are many clear disciplined pathways that people are attracted to. But yeah, I would just say that I think it can easily become another cage.
Yeah. So, Darcy, I'm going to repeat your quote from a few minutes ago, that may my view be as vast as the sky and as fine as flower. And I wrote flower in two different ways, and they work.
Yeah, and may my actions be as fine as flower. Yeah.
Or may my actions be as fine as flower, or flowers. I'm gonna. So our time is moving on, and I just want to move it in a slightly different direction, and I do want to come back to this question of those of us who are starting out. But before I do that, Nora Young, who is the host of the marvelous CBC show Spark, often has ended her show with the wish that her listeners appreciate that technologies are not neutral. And her show Sparks is all about the technologies, the emerging technologies in our life. And she says, not only do I want my listeners to realize that technologies are not neutral, but therefore that they have values embedded in them, and further, that those values are the values of the dominant culture. That always causes me to pause, and it's led me to reflect that perhaps our social technologies embody the values of the dominant culture as well, and that those values may be different than the convictions, the mindset, and the values that we've been talking about for the past 45 minutes. Do you have a reflection on that?
I would agree, and I mean it kind of strikes a chord. I'm also looking at another one of the questions about reconciliation, and I'm thinking about how, one of the other dimensions of this pattern of who is as important as how is that when we commit to being more aware, one of the first ways that we can do that is by unpacking our own privilege and our own, whatever that is and however that takes form. And so I think it's important, to have familiarized, done the work in both listening, for myself. I spent a fair amount of time organizing in the U.S. and they're in progressive communities, they're much better there at talking about whiteness. I mean, they have race issues so much differently constructed in the United States than we do in Canada. But I think, my class situatedness and my whiteness and my own family history of being a settler to Canada, and how that intersects with the current world and the benefits that I have had, which are totally unearned and on the basis of, my family's socioeconomic status, and just kind of having to unpack some of those dimensions at the personal level makes us much more aware of when we're just unconsciously reproducing them on whatever platform, whether it's a technological platform or a platform, a podium, a conversation. So I think issues around unpacking privilege and addressing issues of the lack of equality in human relations and how they've gotten structured over time is absolutely a critical part of this pattern and all of the work we're doing. So, I mean, that's not exactly an answer to your question, but I do feel, I mean, the other problem with, our quick, rapid pace of technology and it's sort of, the things, everything from the digital divide as who has access and whose voices matter online, to the inability of 140 characters to convey anything of nuance or a meeting place of different worldviews and ethnic perspectives. So I do think there's some problems with the way that we're connecting socially, and that goes the same way as sort of thinking that it's something how somehow we can connect beyond race and ethnicity and history through technology, because I don't think that that's possible either. So I think it's something to really it's an inquiry to be embraced at this time, and I'm part of the inquiry, and I don't have a lot of answers.
Well, thank you. That was very reflective, and I think on one level that this question of privilege it can be associated with a set of values, a set of assumptions about the way the world works and the way the world should work, that if we're not careful, we then impose on others who may come from a different perspective, have a different set of values and the like. And so, I think you did address this question, and I like your conclusion that we remain curious, thoughtful about the technologies that we embrace to solve or address our social challenges, but also the mindsets, the assumptions, the values that we bring to that. Darcy, these concluding minutes will likely be more rapid fire questions, but I wanted to ask you again to go back to your younger activist self. It strikes me that starting out today as a change maker means being confronted more severely, if I could put it that way, more clearly with the paradox of hurrying up and waiting. You talked about the Great Bear Rainforest taking 20 years to achieve the results that people aspired to originally, and of course that involved a lot of hard work on a continuous basis. I wonder sometimes whether a younger generation of change makers are confronted with not only the need to hurry up, because the challenges seem to be getting worse or more severe, but also having to deal with the reality that they may not get it done in time. Now, I don't want I don't want to throw a wet blanket on the conversation, but it strikes me that there is this tension and I wondered if you had some advice for us. I guess probably, first of all, do you agree that that tension exists, and how would you advise that we begin to think about it?
Yeah, it's a huge tension. A few things come to mind. One is that especially for young people, I mean, we're living in a time right now where I believe that it's so critical for people to um, presence and name the future that we want to live in and the future that we want to claim for ourselves. And so younger people have an incredible power to do this because they're the generation that's inheriting the messes that have been made previously. And so I think that while, young people may feel not empowered, there's an incredible power in being able to see into the future and say, because humans are not great at thinking beyond our own small lifespans. And so, the sort of the idea of future generations as it's embodied in younger people and that kind of call to responsibility is something that's, I think, incredibly powerful, and human beings relate to it, and it calls to people. I mean, in the research that I did in my PhD, we looked at the next big agreement that happened after the Great Bear Rainforest was this boreal agreement. And it was so interesting talking to some of the senior vice presidents of forest companies about how when there were children and babies in the room, because a bunch of the female campaigners had kids and would bring one of them in particular would bring her baby to negotiations, and how the presence of babies and children affected their ability to try to discount issues of future generations. So there's something really potent about that. But the other thing I'll say is that a lot of the different practices, and they can be called spiritual practices, but you can also make them very prosaic and work in organizations, is expanding our sense of time, right? So, I mean, there are lots of tools for that, like backcasting and future search and other things. But in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we envision this sky full of hundreds of billions of Buddhas, and like more than you can imagine, and just spreading out in time and space infinitely. And these practices of really connecting to how long, we live in a 15 billion year old universe. We need to think about and ground ourselves in the fact that there is a lot of space at the same time that there is absolute urgency, and to kind of hold those things together creates a beautiful paradox. And I think it's a real source of strength.
Thank you, Darcy. We are getting dangerously close to the end here, and my goodness, there's a couple of questions that have come forward that we won't address, but I think they suggest topics for a future conversation. One that interests me particularly is the difference between women as campaigners, changemakers, and and men. And maybe the framing I've just given is not entirely appropriate. It's not so much difference in the terms of better, but just difference in terms of breadth, depth, comparing breadth and depths of experience. But that's for another time, and I'm sure there will be. Darcy, your views are as vast as the sky, and your words are as fine as flower. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you haven't listened to the other patterns in this podcast series, I encourage you to do so. I also encourage you to participate in my little contest that I've got going for another month, which is to come up with a list of all the references to songs. They're all Canadian songs. In my book Impact. Big prize associated with it, so I encourage you to do that. And with a final thanks to Darcy and deep appreciation to Tamarack, I send it back to you, Christy.
Wow, thank you so much, Al and Darcy. That was really powerful, and you've provided so much insight and inspiration to all of us. Thank you to everyone for joining us. The comments and questions that we had were so wonderful this time around, and I know we only got to a few, but I will be sending them all to Al as inspiration for future webinars. Big thank you as well to our partners who have helped make this series possible. BC Partners for Social Impact Plan, Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network, Social Innovation Generation, ABCD in Action, and Ashoka. Last but certainly not least, we would like to thank our supporters, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, the Maitrey Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Province of Ontario for making these calls possible. As promised at the beginning of the call, in a few days we'll email you the links to the audio and other material related to today's call, including a code for your free download copy of Al's book. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email Tamarack to let us know how we're doing. We have had such a wonderful time working closely with you, Al, over these past few months, and really look forward to continuing to dive deeply with you into some of these topics, and also the 6 patterns as one of our thought leaders here at Tamarack. A friendly reminder, as Al mentioned, that all these sessions are being posted on our online library at www.deepeningcommunity.ca. We're also really excited to continue working with Al and Vicky. They will be joining us in Edmonton, Alberta for our Deepening Community National Gathering from June 7th to 9th, 2016 as keynote speakers. There will be more information on this in the next few weeks. They will also be co-hosting an exciting learning series with us in 2016 where they will take a deep dive into the notion of caring as a foundation to healthy communities. So stay tuned as well for more information on and details on that. Al and Vicky are also available for seminars on the 6 patterns, and you are welcome to contact Al directly to discuss this exciting opportunity at al@impact6.ca. And finally, we have some other exciting events coming up, and we encourage you to visit our website at www.tamarackcommunity.ca to learn more and sign up for a monthly e-magazine Engage. Thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful day.